Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Somedude 267, Longsight, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, and Mr. Blackrose. You are the reason why this content remains just the worst, and today we are going to discuss more of just the worst. That's right. It's back again. What is still arguably the most popular thing I do on this channel, 5 more of the worst trains ever. Part 16. I don't know how we got this far, but here we are. The Alstom Citadis Spirit. This cute little creation is a low-floor articulated light rail vehicle that was developed by Alstom specifically for Ottawa's O-Train, a light metro transit system in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And on paper, they should have been fine. These are very recent trains, entering service on September 14th, 2019. Depending on their configuration, they have room for up to 370 passengers and are capable of traveling about 56 miles per hour or 90 kilometers per hour. The first order went to Ottawa, of course, but a second order actually went through to the Government of Ontario's Metrolinx Transit Agency. As it stands, 38 have been built, and 95 are currently under construction. So this is a very current train, not so much historical. What's wrong with it? Right now, it appears to be mostly everything. The first issue that cropped up was the doors. It was found the automated doors on the vehicles that many EMUs or DMUs, or really any subway or metro train setup uses, would actually experience severe faults if they were pried open or held back by passengers. Now when you say it out loud, it sounds like it's the passenger's fault, and true. Also, for those of you who have ridden on subways or metros before, how many times have you seen someone hold open a door for somebody? How often do people do that? The spirits can't deal with that apparently, even though it's such a common thing, and they only got worse from there. Their onboard computer systems had integration issues with the train control system that the railways were using. And you think they would have checked to make sure their systems were compatible with the trains before actually buying them? I feel like somebody really screwed that up. It's just a thing to mention. After those issues were resolved, though, reliability improved until November and December of 2019, when electrical problems started cropping up due to improperly cleaned electrical contacts, which is not necessarily the train's fault. But then, throughout January 2020, the trains kept failing, and it turned out that their onboard heating systems actually weren't good enough to combat Ottawa's sub-zero winter temperatures. And I know I said this last time, but I feel like I keep having to say it now. It gets cold in Canada. And you should probably make sure that your trains, if they are being sent there, can handle the cold, because they're gonna run into it. By January 30th, 2020, Metrolinx's Confederation line where the Spirits were operating was actually at an all-time operational low, because they were short 5 trains specifically due to these. And that wasn't all. By July 2nd, 2020, they found that cracks were forming in some of the wheels. Upon investigating this, it was found that an improperly aligned screw in the design of the Spirits was actually causing extra stress on the wheels, resulting in the cracks. Alstom said they would fix this, but then on August 8th, 2021, an out-of-service train derailed because a single wheel just came off the tracks while it was crossing a switch. And when they looked into it, they found that the fault within the axle bearing assembly was probably the cause of the derailment. My point is the Spirits, right now as it stands, are just the worst. They're not doing at all what they're supposed to be doing. There's teething problems, and then there's just not working. And it seems like these are in the not working category, if you ask me. But it's still early, and it's possible Alstom can fix them and make them actually function, but it's clearly going to take some time because they keep running into issues. The British Rail Class 07. I am neither happy nor sad, neither angry nor hurt. I feel nothing for you. It's just the way it is. I am a hollow, emotionless being, and you destroyed me. It's a thing you've done. I just need you to know that. The Class 07s are a diesel-electric locomotive that were built by Ruston and Hornsby in 1962, specifically for the southern region of British Railways. There were 14 in total made. In their defense, they weren't the worst things British Rail ever used, but they had a recurring problem that at no point was resolved during their time, and it had to do with their axle boxes. The Class 07s were actually pretty fast for shunting diesels, which is what they were. They could travel up to 27.5 miles per hour, or 44.3 kilometers per hour, and it was thought they could possibly do some main line work that way, but this was impossible because the axle boxes always ran hot when traveling at high speed. This issue kept cropping up no matter what they did. It had actually made moving them around to different yards very difficult. Normally, shunter classes would have their side rods removed and traction motors isolated and would just be attached to a regular train that was heading in the direction they had to go to be useful. But the 07s could never be transferred this way, they always had to go by road, which made a ton of extra work, and even in regular operation the axle boxes had a habit of overheating. It made them very difficult to work with, and ultimately they could only ever be used at the Southampton Docks or the Eastleigh Works. When they were kept at low speed in those areas, and they didn't even bother trying to move them around, they were alright, they could do the job, but their inflexibility really sealed the deal on them, and they were withdrawn between 1973 and 1977. Though, interestingly, they actually got quite a bit of preservation, probably because, at the end of the day, they are cute-looking diesels, and in preservation, moving at low speeds, just helping to shunt things around, they're actually kind of useful in that regard. 7 of them wound up preserved in various places around the UK. You can actually still see this locomotive if you want to, but just make sure they don't run them at very high speed, otherwise they'll become hotter than the sun. The BN-Holec electrical rail train. Hey look, it's INKA again. Didn't we talk about these guys before? This is another Indonesian EMU, and they're also known as the EA101s. They were produced between 1994 and 2001, and they actually started operating in 1994, and then were withdrawn by 2014. And I bet you're wondering, why? Well, part of their problem is that they run on AC current, not DC, which most of the rail lines in Indonesia are apparently set up for. This issue meant that they required a DC to AC voltage inverter. And even with that installed, they still suffered frequent breakdowns due to other reliability issues. But their biggest problem was actually overload. They were sometimes too heavy to run effectively, sometimes even causing derailments. The reason for this is actually twofold. For one thing, they were made of very heavy components. That in itself wouldn't be a big deal, if not for the fact that when at full capacity, it suddenly inhibited them. Even though there was technically room for everybody on the train, they still had problems when they had too many people on board. This problem only got worse as a result of people riding illegally, traveling on the roof, or hanging from the door. Now, people are not supposed to do this, but other trains on the network could have people do this and still be able to move around effectively. The Holeks were never able to handle that, and that on top of their reliability issues made them way more of a headache than it was ever worth dealing with. However, many of the units actually wound up converted into other locomotives, such as KRDEs or Holek KRLs. So while in their original form they were atrocious, they did find a new lease on life later, so I guess it wasn't a complete waste. The New South Wales 41 class locomotive. Built by British Thomson Euston between 1953 and 1954, they only produced 10 of them, but these diesel electrics became infamous for being just impossible to work with. From the very beginning, they suffered failures including overheating and, fires. That's totally reasonable. Why would you ever not test a locomotive to make sure it doesn't burst into flame? I just feel like that's one key factor that should always be avoided, and yet on these lists I always seem to find these locomotives that were notorious for trying to become a pillar of unquenchable fire. The problem appeared to be in the radiators, and they were relocated further to the ends of all 10 of the locomotives, and the air ducts were modified. Even with that problem remedied, the Paxman 12-RPHL engines they were using never really worked that well, and when it came time to possibly replace them, it was found that it was cheaper to actually just invest in brand new Class 48s, so they did that instead. Incredibly, one did get preserved. In December of 1976, 4102 was placed by the Public Transport Commission in the custody of the NSW Rail Museum, and it's now considered an NSW heritage item. They actually used it a little bit in service for a while, until one of its engines failed. Then they used it as a one-engine shunter until the batteries wore out in 1987, and then it pretty much went into storage and stayed there, because it's just not worth it anymore. Even in preservation, you find a way to disappoint us. Why are you this way, Class 41? The New Zealand DL class locomotive. Okay, I hope y'all are sitting comfortably, because this is a complicated tale of some terrible decision-making by Kiwi Rail. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of back and forth between management of New Zealand's rails changing hands from Transrail to Toll Holdings, and the negotiations with the New Zealand Railways Corporation, and a whole bunch of government and corporate jargon that I do not have time to get into, but the point is this. The issue they wound up with was that they needed new diesels. They didn't want to wait too long to get them, and by the time anyone was ready to order them, Kiwi Rail was in charge. The debate was whether or not to import new diesels or make new diesels in New Zealand. Critics of the latter were concerned that there just wasn't enough capable labor within New Zealand to actually produce their own diesels. They would have to import. The problem was time. They wanted these diesels fast, and whenever you want something very quickly, you either have to purchase an already pre-existing product, or if you really want something exclusive just for you, and you want it slapped together, it ain't gonna be something that's gonna be very nice. They toyed with the idea of possibly contracting EMD, but they wanted it fast, and EMD has, quality control. So instead they use CRRC Dalian Company, sometimes abbreviated as D-Loco. What is that? Have you ever heard of it before? They're a Chinese company. Now, China has produced decent diesels before. Let's not say anything against China in particular, but in this instance, the DL classes did not turn out to be great at all. They are technically still in service as of now, but from the get-go they had a lot of enemies. There were a ton of union issues with these things, saying that they were unsafe. That part is probably a little bit untrue, as they were worried about visibility, and I can tell you, looking at them, look, there's big windows right in the front of it. The driver can see, alright, that's not really an issue with these. What was more of an issue is that they simply didn't work. Technical problems with a wide variety of their internal components were all over the place. Kiwi Rail insists, to this day, that these teething problems were normal, and that reliability was improving, which is really funny, because a more recent article from the 11th of June 2020 looked further into this, and no, they haven't improved. They're still pretty terrible, actually. And Kiwi Rail wants to buy more. That is also not mentioning the fact that asbestos was found in a few of them. Oh yes, really. You know, we live in the 21st century, and I think for the most part we understand that asbestos is bad, and you shouldn't put it in anything. Apparently the Chinese manufacturers didn't get the memo, because in a resin used for the soundproofing within the locomotives, some asbestos was found. Now to be fair, this was a little overblown, as the amount they found was minimal. None of it was airborne, none of it was in dust form, it really was insignificant. But the point is, it was still there, and it shouldn't have been there at all. Oh yes, another early problem that they had is that the alternator fan tended to fail, and by fail, I mean the blade would break off, and threatened to impale anyone standing near it. The instructions given to the Kiwi Rail employees were simply not to enter the alternator compartment and to keep the doors shut when the engine was running, because that'll solve that problem. I mean, it'll keep them from getting impaled, but I think you're missing the point, Kiwi. These diesels are not good, and they're still not good. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. Are you taking some pages out of British Rail's playbook? Did you like getting these bad diesels? No, I take that back. I can't compare this to British Rail, because at least British Rail, when they got a bunch of bad diesels, had the good sense to give up on them and replace them with better ones. You guys are sticking to your guns with these DLs, and I'm not sure that's a great idea, but maybe they'll get better. Maybe they will, but I'm not going to hold my breath on this. Till next time. This is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.